Hara was glad she had given in and let Gideon buy her a fur coat the last time they had been in Moscow. The snow worked in tight flurries around them as the ship moved through the air. The air itself had a sharp bite to it. So Hara had the fur coat tucked up around her neck, Angel was tucked under the fur and was half wrapped around her ribs. The cold weather could be fatal to the small clockwork creature, so Hara put up with her movement, which tickled. Hara asked her father, who was standing next to her on the deck. "What the heck is here which hasn't frozen to a chunk of ice already?" Marvin pointed to a small hut. "Over there. He should be waiting for us. Though he might have a bit of gear." That was what he said in his letters. Hara could see some buildings in the distance. She tuned out her father, as she really didn't want to hear about her father's latest deals. Besides, more than half of his words were usually lies. The blazing blunderbuss came to a stop near the buildings, and Hara threw the rope ladder over the side. The others would come down in the slower lift, but she wanted to have a look at the agent first. The buildings were mostly warehouses and a small cabin attached to the side of one of the warehouses. The door opened of the cabin and a man stepped out. He threw up his arms. "Where have you been? You were supposed to be here last week." Hara looked over her shoulder and saw that her father had also come down on the rope ladder. Marvin approached the agent and spoke to him soothingly. Hara followed them all into the house, only to find it was a lab. The walls were white and the room was filled with metal tables with racks of test tubes on them. It was also freezing inside. Didn't the man heat the place? The man was already collecting up his tools. He was throwing them haphazardly into a leather case. He said to her, "Make sure your men are careful with the case." He motioned to a case sitting by the door. Marvin asked, "And the rest?" The other man waved his hand dismissively. "Leave it. They have promised me a top-of-the-line lab. This is all rubbish in comparison to what I will have when I get here." Hara picked up the case herself. It wasn't heavy and it clinked with glass as she moved out of the cabin/lab. Marvin said, "Well, let us be on our way, Doctor." The man corrected him. "That is Professor." Marvin laughed at his mistake. "Oh, that is right. Well, let us get you onto the airship and out of here straight away, Professor." Hara doubted the man was a professor. He might have been at one time, but from the setup here in the middle of nowhere, she doubted he had a position anywhere. Let alone something as prestigious as a university professorship. They all climbed onto the lift and she placed the case at her feet as she controlled the lift's rise to the airship. Angel twisted, tickling her. Hara resisted the urge to giggle. Everyone eyed her as she squirmed. When Angel settled, Hara ignored the looks and set the lock of the lift. The professor disappeared into the ship without waiting to be invited. Hara motioned to Talon and the man went after the professor to make sure he didn't get lost. Hara said to her father, "What is all this about?" She knew most of it from reading his letters, but she wanted to hear what he had to say. Marvin shrugged, but she didn't believe for a moment he didn't know exactly what was going on. She narrowed her eyes and said, "We are not going anywhere without some answers." Hara motioned to the case at her feet. "Let's start with this." Marvin wrinkled his nose and finally said, "It is a cure for what ails the world." Hara was not fooled. "And what ails the world?" He glanced further into the ship. Probably looking out for someone. Anger dashed through her as she realized who he was looking for. "You mean dragons?" Marvin's eyes shifted and he tucked his hands in his pockets. Hara threw up her arms in the air. "You brought a poison for dragons on my ship where I so happened to have a dragon. A dragon who just saved your life 2 days ago. Are you crazy?" He shook his head. "It will only be the dragons who attack Roche. You work for them, so it won't be a problem." Hara put out a hand to make him stop talking. She took a long breath. He had no idea. That was partly her fault. She could have told her father more about her rocky relationship with the Roche government. This poison would just give the Roche one more piece of leverage to keep her working as a privateer. If the Empire ever found out she had played a part in this poison, she would never be able to run to them for help. She would be alone in the world. Hara waved for her father to leave. She crouched and picked up the case. She would store it in her room. There was no way she was going to let this leave her sight. It bugged her that the professor would leave it in her hands. He was a fool to trust her father or the Roche. He was probably too busy drooling over the idea of a new lab to care who he was working for. Once her father was gone, Gideon stepped out of the shadows. He didn't look pleased. He asked, "What are you going to do with that?" Hara ignored his tone as she was angry as well and could understand his anger. She tucked the case under her arm. "Make sure it never sees the light of day. Walk with me while I put this away. Between the two of us, we can make sure it is never left alone." He calmed down and nodded his head sharply. Gideon watched Hara sleep. She would probably be very mad with him if she caught him here. He grinned at the thought. But he wasn't here to admire her. He had a mission. The case was easy to find. It was in a hidden safe under Hara's bed. It wasn't large and the lock was easy. He cracked it in a moment. He really missed this sometimes. In the early days when he had refused to kill people, he had simply snuck into homes to take what he had needed. That was when he learned to appreciate the little things in life like a comfortable home. He flipped the top of the case open. Inside was about 50 vials of a pale yellow liquid. He picked one up and tilted it to have a look at the substance inside. It looked like lemon juice, and when he shook the vial it went clear. He had vials like these somewhere. Gideon put the vials with its mates and closed the case. He wandered to the galley. Henry was sleeping in a hammock off the preparation area. He didn't stir as Gideon moved around. Gideon took a few lemons and made enough liquid to fill 50 vials. He twisted his hand and brought the vials which had been in his home in the city to where he was in the blazing blunderbuss. He had stored them in his treasure room, which really didn't exist in this world at all, but was mostly accessible from his apartment in the city. He flipped his hair out of the way and filled the vials in precise movements. This wasn't the first time he had worked with vials and liquids. In his early days at universities he had earned his way by working as a lab assistant. Gideon cleaned up after himself and returned to Hara's room. She was no longer there. It had taken him longer to make the substitute poison. He wasn't concerned. He knew where she would be. She was on watch, so he had time to move around her room. He replaced the vials and wondered what he could do with the real poison. He took the vials and made them go in between space. It wasn't permanent, but it would do until he could figure out what to do with them. Hara knocked softly on the door. "Professor." The doctor was writing something down and didn't look up, but motioned her inside. He reminded her of a real professor at that moment. She had assumed the title he insisted on was because he had once been a professor. Curious, she asked, "What school, by the way?" The professor looked up surprised. The University of Prague." "Not many people ask." "How can I help you, Captain?" Hara didn't go any further into his room, instead she leaned against the door. "That chest you had us bring along. I have put it under guard in my room. You want to tell me what is inside?" He flicked a few pages and seemed to draw his attention away from the conversation as he said, "Well, it was supposed to be a genetic manipulation virus which would make the human race more superior, but instead it has an adverse effect on any dragon who is bonded with humans. Wasn't what I expected, but it will get me a new lab." As Hara thought. He was immoral. All he cared for was recognition, and in his mind that meant a fully kitted out lab. A very dangerous man indeed. Her father was a fool to deal with him. Hara nodded her head to the professor. Thank you for appeasing my curiosity, Professor. The professor beamed. My pleasure.